I did some errands today, probably drove 40 miles. Stuff's a lot better, but now we have what I think is a new problem. First, the good stuff. The oil pan, not leaking. Automatic transmission pan, not leaking. There's no thumping. There's good power to the rear wheels. However, it seems that one of the wheel bearings is bad now. So we need to fix a vibration and grinding noise on the right-hand side. So we'll do a quick drive. I'll show you what I mean. I'll also show you when we turn to the right, it doesn't grind. So that's what makes me think that it's the intermediate bearing carrier on the right and not the wheel bearing. But we are going to change both of them. It remains. So if we take this right at speed, it stops until we straighten out. So that makes me think it's the way the bearing is out of place or has gotten worn out from driving forward. You should see it again. As long as the wheel is turned to the right. So I put the car back up in the air and I took off both of the front wheels and I listened to the caliper bracket and to the wheel carrier and to the lower suspension arm as well as the engine subframe. The only place I heard a noise was in the wheel carrier and then the caliper bracket as well because it's attached to it. I heard like a bump, 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 an irregular noise. And if I touch near the engine, I hear it a little bit, but not as pronounced as the wheel carrier. Today we're going to change the wheel bearing and the axle carrier on the right hand side of a E46 XI. To diagnose this, I had used the mechanic stethoscope to hear where the grind was. So probably two special tools that you're going to need to make this go is a 36 millimeter 12-point socket for the axle nut and a bearing race separator such as something like this with a blade style. As we saw, I think that the primary failure is the bearing in this axle carrier. And I've heard of some people who are able to replace the bearing in the tube. However, the BMW guides and everything say just to replace the whole carrier. So that's what we're going to do, because the flange lip was also broken from some previous work, because this is forged aluminum, so it doesn't take the force of when trying to pry out the axle. So we have a new circlip. We have to make sure we take the circlip out before we press out the bearing. When we pull out the wheel center flange, the inner bearing race is almost for sure going to come with it, and that's what the bearing separator is for. We have a new dust cover for the wheel flange, because the one that's on there is pretty corroded. And what I'm going to show you is the minimum that I've found to be able to get this apart. So there's 2 self-locking nuts we'll need to replace for the wheel carrier's outer ball joint and the power steering arm, the outer tie rod, that will allow us to get the carrier down. There's just 4 bolts that holds the wheel carrier on, so we have 4 new BMW wave washers to secure that to the XI oil pan. When we're separating the outboard inner bearing race from the wheel hub, we need this blade bearing separator. If the inner race has started coming off, awesome, but it probably won't. So we need to use a chisel, and we'll rotate the flange to start it coming off. And then once we get the blade in there, then we can just push it off. I'll show you doing that. When we start taking this apart, we need to unstake the axle nut. And then with the 12.36 millimeter socket, we'll loosen this before we take the brakes off. Now we got this loose. Now we can take the caliper bracket off and the rotor, get this the rest of the way apart. Separated the steering ball joint. We got the rotor and the brakes off. I took out the bolt that holds the bracket. This is the pinch bolt. This is the pinch joint. We'll separate this with the chisel so then the carrier can come down, and then we'll get the axle out of the carrier, and then we can put the ball joint separator on the bottom of the carrier, and then we can get the carrier in the press. I put this chisel into the pinch joint, so now by myself I'm able to separate it from the strut. And then once I'm separated from the strut, I'll be able to pull the carrier and get this axle out. I need to be able to kick out the bottom so I can get the axle out, so that then I can drop the carrier low enough. Because this is engineered without weight, that the carrier won't come down far enough to let go of the strut unless the spring is broken. So we're going to put a sideways ball joint splitter here to get this off, and then we'll be able to get the axle out as we take this down. I have the axle collapsed the whole way, and I have the wheel turned all the way to the left so that I can get this ball joint separator on from the side to push this ball joint off the bottom of the carrier so that then it can swing out. Okay, looks like it's free of the carrier. So now we're free that way, so I'm going to put this chisel in the pinch joint. So now the axle will almost come out. We'll support the axle here. Looks like it just needs just a little bit of convincing. And now we can separate this bearing on the bench. I used a punch to push out the axle without having to remove the subframe, to use a fork. So now the axle's free of the lock ring. We use the punch to push it out. We can pull the axle out. Make sure you pull it out from the inner hub, because if you don't, you can just pull this axle. You can pull the axle, the triple roller bearings will just come right out of the cup. You want to try to pull out straight. So this still seems pretty good. So I think it is that bearing. We're going to take the axle carrier off, then we can look at that bearing, see if that bearing has fallen off or if there's stuff in the roller. Here's the tube before we take anything off. The bearing's spinning pretty regularly. Not sure what this might be a chip. This might be the problem. We'll take this off and check it out. So now we're just going to take off the 4 bolts that holds the axle carrier to the XI oil pan. And usually the wave washers are pretty beat, so that's why we got new wave washers. So I disconnected the grounding strap to be able to get that off. And I don't really see anything in here. But we're going to put the new unit on and we'll see how it does. Here's old and new. The bearing spins pretty freely. It's about the same spin on the new one. See if this makes a difference. So now we need to get the wheel flange out of the bearing. The inner race is going to come out with it. If you don't have a vise, you can pull this out before you take it off the car. That should provide you enough support to get it out of there. But I'm going to put it in a vise and just pull it off with this 10-pound slide hammer. So the race came off with it. So we'll just rip this metal face off and then chisel this loose and use the bearing separator to pull it the rest of the way. To press the rest of this out, if we get rid of the dust cover, then there's a circlip, a snap ring in here. It's in a groove, so we need to squeeze it together so that it can come out. So now we'll put this on the press and we can push the whole bearing out with the inner race. It will push out. The flange will push the outer part of the bearing out, and then we'll push the new one in. So now with this 58mm cup, I'm going to push the inner race, and that will also push the outer race out of the wheel carrier. I guess I'm just going to pump it until it poops out and then be like, you're welcome.
Please just leave that in the video.
Okay, so now we got this lined up. Now we're just going to pump it until we poop it out. No. Wait, actually, I think I'm just going to do a demonstrator with this cup. So we have a closed end 58 millimeter hardened steel cup, and we're pushing the center race. That will push the whole thing out. So I have a cup bigger than the 60 millimeter bore for the backside bearing, so just support the shape of the carrier squarely on this bottom plate. I'm going to get this bearing started just by putting the flat side of this plate on top, get it started in there, and then I think I'll just push it the rest of the way in with the old bearing because I don't have a cup the right size. There's a taper on the carrier. It looks like it's straightening out. Oh, there we go. Nice thing about doing it this way, this won't get trapped in here because of the taper. It won't be interference tight. So I'll just be able to take the old bearing right out of the hole. So we'll make sure we get started nicely. That's bottoming out. So now we'll get the new circlip in there to keep the bearing in the carrier, push the new dust cover on, and then get the new wheel flange in there. So you need to compress the ring to get it in here. And then the best way I found to put this on is to just press it on. It's pretty clear when it bottoms out, and then I'll make sure it's flush and square. There we go. So now the new bearing's in here, new circlip, new dust cover. Just need to get the new wheel flange in here. So to get this inner race off, get rid of this dust shield. And then get this to start separating with the chisel just enough so that we can get the bearing separator blades in there. I don't feel like that's quite enough hammer. Sorry. So I was able to separate this far enough with the chisel. Then I have the bearing separator blades on here. We're going to crank it down a little bit, move it further away. And once we've cranked it a little bit, then I'm going to get the blades tighter on there, and then we'll just push it the rest of the way off. And it looks like I need to adjust my pusher a little bit. So we got the blade tighter on here just to make sure that we'll be able to pull this off, but I'm making sure that the blades aren't really touching the center because I don't want to mar up the neck of this wheel flange. That's the inner race. So I'm going to just file any high points on here to make sure the flange seats the whole way on the new inner race of the new bearing. And press it in. All right, we got the flange all cleaned up, ready to be reinserted. So we'll switch from 66 millimeter cup that was on the outside to 58 millimeter cup that will press on the center race, because we don't want to depend on the outer race to support the force required to insert the flange back into the inner race. So now this is only going to push on the inner race, and we'll just push the flange in that way. I'm going to start slow, make sure we go in straight. And now I'm just going to crank it until we bottom out. All right, that's bottomed out. Now the new flange is in there. We'll put this back on the car. Okay, we have the carrier back on. We reattach the grounding strap. So now we need to reinsert the axle. I put a bunch of gear oil in the outer flange and in the flange's tube to make sure that's lubricated a little bit. So what I'm also going to do, I'm going to put some gear oil on the axle shaft because this is a pretty tight fit. The taper for the end of the inner part of the axle that rests in that bearing. Okay, so we have the splines starting to mesh in the differential on the other side of the XI oil pan. So now what we need is we need to get the rest of the way in there so that the snap ring expands back into the channel. So then we know we're locked back in. Okay, we've slipped back into the differential. So the ring is expanded. Now we know the axle is in there. Okay, we have the axle back in there. So now we need to start the axle into the carrier and start it rejoining the strut. To make that happen, I'm going to pound this chisel back into the pinch joint. With the chisel in the pinch joint, I'll be able to put the carrier back up on the strut and hold it with one hand while I get the axle in there. So I got both the ball joints back in. I know that I'm back on the strut, and the strut is bottoming out in the carrier. So I'm going to drive this axle nut on at least a little bit. Okay, we're going to get the pinch bolt back in here. We're going to make sure that get the bracket back behind the bolt. And now we'll just tighten things up, put the brakes back on, go for a test drive. Get the ABS sensor back in here. Get the dust shield back on. Get the brake rotor back on here. I'm going to put the caliper bracket back on. You want to make sure there's a little bit of blue Loctite on your caliper bracket bolts. Reinstall the caliper. Just put the outside shoe on first. Okay, I'm going to stake that down and then torque the lug nuts. We're going to go for a test drive. We got the diff topped up, the axle nut tight, staked down, brakes are back on. So let's take it for a drive, see if we get any vibration or noises now. Okay, we were rolling to about 15, no noises. As long as there's no traffic, I'm going to try to apply some power going up this hill. Okay, suspension is starting to settle. We got up to 30 going up the hill. So far, so good. So let's try rolling at speed without power. We'll go down this hill, see how the rolling goes. Rolling pretty smooth. So I think we'll call that fixed. Thanks for watching.